The BBC News now on BBC One with George Alagiah, Sophie Raworth and Emily Maitlis.
At 6 o'clock, Lord Hutton slams the BBC. Taking the blame, the corporation's chairman, Gavin Davies, has resigned. Lord Hutton says BBC management was defective and the Iraq dossier story wasn't checked. Tony Blair is cleared. Allegations that the dossier was sexed up were unfounded.
The allegation that I or anyone else lied to this House or deliberately misled the country by falsifying intelligence on weapons of mass destruction is itself the real lie.
Tonight, as Lord Hutton calls Dr. Kelly a man who served his nation, his family says no one else should ever have to suffer the pressure he did. We'll talk to Nick Higham about what today's stinging criticism means for the future of the BBC. And Andrew Marr's in Westminster as Tony Blair asks all those who accused him of lying to withdraw their allegations fully, openly and clearly.
Tonight on BBC London News, as forecast, the big freeze hits London. As predicted, transport's in chaos. And the silent killer of hepatitis C, 250,000 Londoners now have more chance of a cure.
Good evening and welcome to the 6 o'clock news. First tonight, crisis at the BBC. The chairman of the corporation, Gavin Davies, has resigned. It comes after a scathing report from Lord Hutton, who was looking into the events that led to the death of the government scientist, Dr. David Kelly. Lord Hutton says the BBC allegation that Number 10 published the Iraq dossier, knowing some of it was wrong, was unfounded. Tonight, ALASTAIR Campbell, the former head of communications at Downing Street and a key figure in the row, said the stain on the integrity of the Prime Minister and the government has been removed.
Well, these are the key findings from Lord Hutton's report. He said the editorial system which the BBC permitted was defective. He went on to say the BBC governors are to be criticised for themselves failing to make more detailed investigations after the allegations had been broadcast. About Tony Blair and the eventual naming of Dr. Kelly, he said there was no such dishonourable or underhand or duplicitous strategy devised by the Prime Minister and his officials. And in the end, he said he was satisfied that Dr. Kelly took his own life and that no one could have or should have foreseen it. Well, Nick Higham is at the BBC's Broadcasting House. Now, Nick, this is all very damaging for the BBC.
That's right, Sophie. There were always going to be criticisms of the BBC after Lord Hutton's inquiry. It heard too much evidence of the mistakes the BBC made, many of which the BBC itself admitted. But with the government getting a virtually clean bill of health, the BBC was left horribly exposed. A very bad day for the BBC, and it's culminated in the resignation of the chairman. Within the past few minutes, we've had this statement from Gavin Davies. I have been brought up to believe that you cannot choose your own referee and that the referee's decision is final. There is an honourable tradition in British public life that those charged with authority at the top of an organisation should accept responsibility for what happens in that organisation, and so he's resigned.
And our political editor, Andrew Marr's at Westminster. So the government is cleared?
Absolutely, remarkably, unequivocally, very few hesitations indeed. Tony Blair always hoped that he'd be cleared, he thought he'd be cleared, but really until the last 24 hours, he had no idea quite what Lord Hutton was going to say. He did, in a sense, choose the referee himself, of course, but he didn't know what Lord Hutton would do. And, you know, had there been one phrase this long accusing him of deceit or saying that the dossier was sexed up, then I'd be standing here today talking about Tony Blair's resignation as Prime Minister, I suspect. In some respects, the last couple of days, because we had the tuition fees vote as well, which he squeaked through, has been a double or quits experience for Tony Blair. Well, it's double.
Andrew, Nick, more from both of you in a moment. But first, the details of today's Hutton Report.
It was 12:30 precisely when Lord Hutton walked into Court 76 at the Royal Courts of Justice to deliver his long-awaited verdict on the circumstances surrounding the death of Dr. David Kelly. Nicholas Witchell followed the inquiry throughout last summer and now reports on how it has ended.
He spent nearly 4 months weighing the evidence, assessing the testimony of more than 70 witnesses. Lord Hutton's conclusions are contained in the 700 pages of his report. A report into the circumstances surrounding the death of Dr. David Kelly, the former Iraq weapons inspector who was found dead near his home last July.
Silence, all rise.
In a televised statement summarising his conclusions, Lord Hutton dealt first with the cause of Dr. Kelly's death. It was suicide.
I'm satisfied that Dr. Kelly took his own life by cutting his left wrist and that his death was hastened by his taking coproximal tablets. I'm further satisfied that there was no involvement by a third person in Dr. Kelly's death.
Lord Hutton then turned to the various parties involved in the affair, starting with the role of the BBC. Lord Hutton is utterly unsparing in his criticism of the BBC, from its reporter Andrew Gilligan and his unfounded allegation, to its defective editorial controls, and the BBC governors and their failure properly to investigate. Andrew Gilligan's claim in an unscripted radio broadcast about the 45-minute claim was a grave attack on the government's integrity, Lord Hutton said.
The allegations reported by Mr. Gilligan on the BBC Today programme on the 29th of May 2003 that the government probably knew that the 45 minutes claim was wrong or questionable before the dossier was published, and that it was not inserted in the first draft of the dossier because it only came from one source, and the intelligence agencies did not really believe it was necessarily true, were unfounded.
The BBC's Director General and Editor-in-Chief Greg Dyke and his senior executives failed to check whether Gilligan's claim could be relied upon, and the corporation's chairman and governors failed too.
Therefore, in the very unusual and specific circumstances relating to Mr. Gilligan's broadcast, the governors are to be criticised for themselves failing to make more detailed investigations into whether this allegation reported by Mr. Gilligan was properly supported by his notes, and for failing to give proper and adequate consideration to whether the BBC should publicly acknowledge that this very grave allegation should not have been broadcast.
And so to the government, accused of much, cleared today by Lord Hutton of virtually everything. For the government, number 10, the Ministry of Defence, the Joint Intelligence Committee, Lord Hutton's report makes very welcome reading. Put simply, he exonerates them all of improper conduct. When the Prime Minister came to the Royal Courts of Justice to give evidence to the inquiry, he denied there'd been a covert strategy to place Dr. Kelly's name in the public domain. Lord Hutton accepted the evidence of the government witnesses.
As the inquiry proceeded, and I heard more evidence about the surrounding circumstances and the considerations which influenced those in government, I came to the conclusion that the reality was that there was no such underhand strategy.
There was no dishonourable, underhand or duplicitous behaviour by any minister or official. The only mild criticism was of the Ministry of Defence, which, Lord Hutton said, could have done more to help Dr. Kelly after the media had discovered his identity.
It must have been a great shock and very upsetting for him to have been told in a brief telephone call from his line manager, Dr. Wells, on the evening of the 9th of July, that the press office of his own department had confirmed his name to the press, and must have given rise to a feeling that he'd been badly let down by his employer.
On the government's dossier on Iraq's alleged weapons of mass destruction, Lord Hutton said it wasn't his task to assess the reliability of the intelligence. He also said there was nothing wrong with ALASTAIR Campbell, the Prime Minister's then communications chief, making drafting suggestions on the dossier's presentation. Suggestions which were considered by John Scarlett, the MI6 man who was chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee, or JIC. Again, there was only one small area of concern.
I consider that the possibility cannot be completely ruled out that the desire of the Prime Minister to have a dossier which, whilst consistent with the available intelligence, was as strong as possible in relation to the threat posed by said of his aides WMD, may have subconsciously influenced Mr. Scarlett and the other members of the JIC to make the wording of the dossier somewhat stronger than it would have been if it had been contained in a normal JIC assessment.
Finally, there is Dr. Kelly himself. Of David Kelly, there is criticism and praise in the report. Criticism of his decision to meet Andrew Gilligan in the first place. Praise for his years of distinguished and devoted service. Lord Hutton said Dr. Kelly should not have gone to this hotel to see Andrew Gilligan.
Dr. Kelly's meeting with Mr. Gilligan was unauthorised, and in meeting Mr. Gilligan and discussing intelligence matters with him, Dr. Kelly was acting in breach of the Civil Service Code of Procedure which applied to him.
He took his life, Lord Hutton said, as a result of a severe loss of self-esteem. He felt people had lost trust in him. Yet Lord Hutton finished his statement by quoting a tribute to David Kelly, the scientist and public servant.
It is most important that the extraordinary public attention and political fallout arising from the events of the past months do not mask the extraordinary achievements of a scientist who loyally served not only his country but also the international community at large.
And that was it. Shortly after Lord Hutton finished his statement, a lawyer spoke on behalf of the Kelly family.
If their personal tragedy is not to be compounded, they urge that, regardless of any criticism or exoneration in the report, the government takes action to ensure that the ordeal suffered by David Kelly will never be repeated.
Nicholas Witchell, BBC News, at the Hutton inquiry at the Royal Courts of Justice.
Well, tonight the BBC finds itself under unprecedented pressure. The chairman has resigned and the governors are meeting right now to try to agree what to do next. Our correspondent, Nick Higham, looks at where the Hutton Report leaves the world's most prestigious news organisation.
He's the reporter who became the story. Andrew Gilligan, arriving this morning at the BBC's London headquarters. It was his conversation with David Kelly that led ultimately to today's report and a bleak day for the BBC. Lord Hutton concluded much of Andrew Gilligan's original report was unfounded. Senior managers like Richard Sambrook, the BBC's Director of News, were accused of presiding over a defective editorial system. In the BBC's newsrooms, they watched Lord Hutton pile up criticisms of the BBC's journalism and management and of the response of its governors when the government complained. The governors, who both run the BBC and regulate it, wanted to defend the BBC's independence, but Lord Hutton said they should have checked their reporters' notes. If they had, they'd have seen his story didn't stand up.
The governors are to be criticised for themselves failing to make more detailed investigations into whether this allegation reported by Mr. Gilligan was properly supported by his notes, and for failing to give proper and adequate consideration to whether the BBC should publicly acknowledge that this very grave allegation should not have been broadcast.
Senior members of the government sensed a BBC on the run.
It is important because he found that the Prime Minister and the government acted throughout with good faith, honesty and integrity, and rarely have I seen a report which so comprehensively vindicates the Prime Minister and comprehensively criticises the integrity and the workings of the British Broadcasting Corporation.
Publicly, the BBC's reaction was subdued.
We note Lord Hutton's criticisms of the BBC. Many of these relate to mistakes which the BBC has already acknowledged in its submissions to the inquiry and for which we've already expressed regret. Thanks to the process of Lord Hutton's inquiry, we now know more about the evolution of the September dossier. The BBC does accept that certain key allegations reported by Andrew Gilligan on the Today programme on May the 29th last year were wrong, and we apologise for them. However, we would point out again that at no stage in the last 8 months have we accused the Prime Minister of lying, and we have said this publicly on several occasions. The dossier raised issues of great public interest. Dr. Kelly was a credible source. Provided his allegations were reported accurately, the public in a modern democracy had a right to be made aware of them. The greater part of the BBC's coverage of the dossier fulfilled this purpose. We've already taken steps to improve our procedures. A new complaints and compliance structure has been put in place under the Deputy Director General. We have a new set of rules for BBC journalists who wish to write for newspapers or magazines, and we will be publishing revised editorial guidelines.
But behind the scenes, there was a dramatic development.
The Chairman of the Governors, Gavin Davies, will tender his resignation.
The hope must be that the BBC chairman's departure will help restore the BBC's worldwide reputation for trustworthiness and credibility.
Gavin Davies's position was obviously untenable following the Hutton Report. It was so overwhelmingly critical of the BBC's structures. The failure to investigate is the problem, and I think that Gavin Davies did what he had to do, fall on his sword.
Now, BBC journalists and governors alike will be asking themselves, with the chairman's resignation, has enough been done to lance the boil? Nick Higham, BBC News, Broadcasting House.
So, as we've just heard, the BBC's chairman, Gavin Davies, has resigned. He's close friends with senior members of the Labour government, something which raised questions when he was appointed. Now, some are asking whether it made him fight all the harder for the independence of the corporation. Duncan Kennedy reports on the man who's been at the top of the BBC.
With the devastating words of Lord Hutton leaving the BBC reeling, there was little doubt the top man had to go. Gavin Davies, the chairman of the Board of Governors, forced out for heading a news organisation that had effectively failed at every level. All along, the man who exudes caution and restraint had tried to fight the BBC's corner, insisting it stood by the Gilligan story and making this statement as the row with the government erupted.
We are wholly satisfied that BBC journalists and their managers sought to maintain impartiality and accuracy during this episode.
Gavin Davies repeated that position at the Hutton inquiry, but the BBC's handling of the whole affair was today comprehensively criticised, leaving no choice for the BBC chairman but to go.
That the governors should have ordered their own independent investigation into whether Andrew Gilligan's notes supported his story, whether the story should have gone to air. They didn't do that. That was a key failing, and that's why Gavin Davies has decided to go.
Gavin Davies has been chairman at the BBC for less than 3 years, but his unprecedented resignation tonight has created one of the biggest crises in the corporation since it was founded in 1927. Before taking over at the BBC, Gavin Davies had been at the centre of the new Labour establishment. He was a donor to the Labour Party. His wife Sue still works for Gordon Brown. 2 of his children here were at the Chancellor's wedding. But some former Labour insiders believe he's been harshly treated.
Gavin Davies and the BBC were accused by ALASTAIR Campbell, the Prime Minister's press secretary, of all being anti-war. And what he was doing and the BBC were doing were standing up against a government that was trying to browbeat them.
Tonight, the media were waiting outside the BBC's headquarters in London, where the governors accepted Gavin Davies' resignation with what they call great reluctance and regret. With the dust still to settle, his may not be the last. Duncan Kennedy, BBC News.
So the Prime Minister, Downing Street officials and the Defence Secretary Geoff Hoon were all completely cleared by Lord Hutton. Our political editor Andrew Marr reports on the verdict on the government.
What a difference a day makes. This morning, Tony Blair, who'd survived the university fee rebellion by just 5 votes, was still being hunted. Charles Kennedy for the anti-war Liberal Democrats and Michael Howard, his new Tory tormentor, have been reading the Hutton Report since 6 a.m, looking for fresh ammunition to use against him. Surely Lord Hutton would have planted a few political weapons of his own. An overnight newspaper leak had said the government was completely cleared. But the real 700-page report couldn't be all one way, could it? Oh, yes, it could.
The truth about that charge is now found. No intelligence was inserted into the dossier by Downing Street. Nothing was put in it against the wishes of the intelligence services. No one, either in Downing Street or in the Joint Intelligence Committee, put any intelligence into it, probably knowing it was wrong. And no such claim to the BBC was made by anyone in charge of drawing up that dossier. Indeed, Lord Hutton's findings go further. He finds the claim was not even made by Dr. Kelly himself. The allegation that I or anyone else lied to this House or deliberately misled the country by falsifying intelligence on weapons of mass destruction is itself the real lie.
And then he demanded a bit of humble pie from the opposition.
I ask that those that have repeatedly claimed that I lied over this issue, or that Sir Kevin Tebbit lied, now withdraw that allegation also unequivocally and in full.
But Mr. Howard, facing a Commons so rowdy it almost had to be suspended, refused to apologise and returned to the attack on the naming of Dr. Kelly.
Is the Prime Minister the only person who thought that issuing that press release would not lead to the naming of David Kelly? Is that what he's asking us to believe? Is he really that naive? Isn't it clear to everyone that the release of the statement authorised by the Prime Minister led inevitably to the naming of David Kelly? Is the Prime Minister really telling this House he had no idea that would happen?
This drew unparliamentary boos from the Labour benches, and this from Tony Blair.
Yesterday was a test of policy for the right honourable gentleman, and he failed it. Today is a test. Today is a test of character, and he has failed that too.
But the Liberal Democrats, like many others, felt the Hutton inquiry had just been too narrow. A much wider inquiry was needed into why Britain went to war.
Now, for those of us who at that point were less than convinced, and that doesn't include either the previous or the current leadership of the Conservative Party, the key questions do still remain outstanding. Why was the decision to go to war at that point taken on the available information? Shouldn't the United Nations Weapons Inspectorate have been given more time? And does the case for an independent inquiry not remain absolutely paramount?
So today, the Prime Minister found his personal position transformed. Others, like the Defence Secretary Geoff Hoon, also found themselves off the hook. But is it a more general turning point? Tony Blair's former aide and political hitman thought it ought to be.
Having been in both journalism and politics, I would say this. If the public knew the truth about politicians, they would be pleasantly surprised. If they knew the truth about the way that parts of our media operate, they would be absolutely horrified.
And this has felt like a transforming day in British politics, when fortunes changed and the familiar was upended. But politicians as popular heroes? The Thames will freeze first. Andrew Marr, BBC News, Westminster.
Now, Nick Higham is at the BBC's Broadcasting House and Andrew Marr is in Westminster. Nick, if I could come to you first, what do you make of the BBC statement? It was part apology, but there was still a claim of public interest.
Well, the BBC all along has defended itself by saying that although it may have made particular mistakes in its reporting of this story, in broad outline what it said was true. But that defence effectively became unsustainable under the sort of relentless scrutiny that Lord Hutton's inquiry focused onto just one of the 20 broadcasts that Andrew Gilligan gave on the 29th of May, the very first at 6:07 in the morning, when he made a series of allegations that were unfounded and which were not supported by his own notes of his conversation with Dr. David Kelly. And with that relentless focus on that one erroneous broadcast, frankly, the BBC was sunk.
Nick, you spoke about the BBC's reputation in your report. Where is it now, worldwide?
Well, not improved. I mean, what we've had today has been a sort of contest between, on the one hand, the government's reputation, credibility, its reputation for truth-telling, and on the other, the BBC's trustworthiness, credibility, and reputation for truth-telling. And the BBC has been weighed in that balance and found wanting. The hope must be that by the top man, the chairman, taking responsibility, then something can be done to recover that reputation. But it's clearly going to be quite a long haul for the BBC to re-establish, not just in Britain, but around the world, that it is still the organisation renowned for accuracy, trustworthiness and truth-telling.
And Andrew, the key issue here was trust, wasn't it? Trust in the Prime Minister, trust in all those around him.
Absolutely. For years, really, the opposition has been trying to make an issue of Tony Blair's trust. You remember all those T-shirts, "Be Liar," that the anti-war movement had. You remember Ian Duncan Smith saying time and time again, "You can't believe a word he says." And we found Michael Howard making a great deal of the suggestion that the Prime Minister had misled the people and misled Parliament, indeed, over David Kelly. Now, what happened today was that line of political attack effectively hit a wall. And the real question for Mr. Blair's critics, political and in other parts of the establishment, is whether they carry on trying to go for his integrity, go for the trust factor, or whether they accept that when it was really looked into in great detail by Lord Hutton on a very, very specific charge, he was so comprehensively cleared that they have to find another line of attack.
So briefly, Andrew, it's a real problem in a sense for Michael Howard because he's tried to make a huge amount of this affair.
Yes, over the last few weeks and Prime Minister's questions, he's been building up the case that the Prime Minister said one thing to journalists and then indeed to the House of Commons about his role in the naming of Dr. Kelly and said something entirely different when he was behind closed doors. Now, Lord Hutton has said that's not true. The Prime Minister has demanded an apology. So far, he hasn't got it.
All right, Andrew Marr, Nick Higham, thank you both.
The time is very nearly 25 minutes past 6.
A reminder of the main news tonight. The chairman of the BBC has resigned after the corporation was heavily criticised by Lord Hutton. Tony Blair and his officials have been cleared of any wrongdoing over the publication of the Iraq dossier.